Welcome to the Sleep Diaries channel. In this video, we'll take a calm and gentle journey into the Middle Ages toward the mysterious centuries often described as lost. Before we begin, you can support the channel by subscribing and liking the video, helping these quiet historical stories reach a wider audience. Now get comfortable. Slow your breathing and let the story guide you into the stillness of the night. Enjoy listening. Now, slowly shake off the weariness of the day, feel the rhythm of your breath, and allow your thoughts to slowly fade away. Tonight, we are going to a time when time is uncertain, when calendars are unclear, when years disappear in the mist, when even history is whispered. Centuries on the cobblestone streets of Europe, where the hoofbeat gently taps on the frozen ground, where the wind glides through the narrow streets, where the candlelight flickers behind the windows. Imagine the long nights. There are times about which so much is said, but so much is left unsaid. They are called lost centuries, dark ages. But in reality, people wake up every morning. They light the fire, they share their bread, and they go on with their lives. The silence in the stone houses, the crackling of the wood fire, thick woolen blankets, shadows cast on the ceiling. As time flowed slowly, there was no noise from the world. Only the howling of the wind, the sound of bells in the distance, and the gentle creaking of wooden doors. In this story, we will hear more of the peaceful footsteps of daily life than the sounds of wars, peasants working slowly in their fields, fishermen mending their nets by the river, monks writing books by candlelight, all of them blending together in the silence of the night like soft images. Now, you can close your eyes, and we are taking the first steps of this long journey. Without straining your mind, without rushing, we will proceed as if turning the pages one by one when it's windy outside. Think of the sounds echoing between the stone walls, the smoke rising from the chimneys, the snowflakes falling on the roofs. Around a frozen well, breathing their warm breaths into the air, hands hidden under long cloaks, the slits in leather gloves, the faint glow of wooden lanterns. In that era, everything was slower than it is now. Distances were long, nights were silent, time was slow, but still, life went on. The smell of bread from the bakeries, the small fires burning in the market square, the misty breaths of horses, church bells ringing in the distance. Some nights the sky was covered with clouds, and some nights the moonlight fell like a thin silver line on the stone roofs, and people walked slowly among these scenes, carried their burdens, and exchanged silent greetings. Now we are at the beginning of this journey through lost centuries, along snow-covered paths, to candle-lit rooms, to calm boats by the river. Take a deep breath and let the story gently lead you to the edge of sleep. A slow morning in stone streets. The sun hasn't fully risen yet. Mist spreads like a soft blanket between the narrow streets. The moisture that accumulated overnight on the stone pavements gleams softly in the dim light. Wooden shutters slowly open. The warmth emanating from inside mixes with the cold morning air. The door of a bakery opens. The smell of fresh bread spreads into the street. From afar, church bells ring with a slow rhythm. The sound melts away and disappears into the mist. A merchant crosses the bridge, loosely holding the reins of his horse. The wheels rubbing against the stones produce a soft sound. People standing in front of the windows wrap themselves in thick cloaks. Their breaths leave a misty trail. Medieval cities would wake up like this in the mornings. There is no rush, no hurry. The first hours of the day belong to silence. A woman draws water from the well. The bucket rises slowly. The drops fall on the stone floor. A child stands in front of the door with a wooden. He plays with the toy. The wheels turn slowly. The city, it's as if it's taking a deep breath. The silence of the marketplace. As the sun rises, the fog slowly dissipates. It filters through the stone walls and disappears. Stalls begin to be set up in the market square. Wooden crates are laid on the ground. The ropes are loosened. Rolls of cloth are slowly unrolled. Wicker baskets are lined up. Small scales are carefully placed. The sellers do not raise their voices. Everything is gentle, measured. Nobody is in a hurry. A man arranges the fish, straightening their gleaming scales. The woman next to him arranges the apple baskets. Another wipes the cheese wheels with a clean cloth. In a corner, the warmth emanating from the blacksmith's shop turns into steam when it encounters the cold air, the slow movement of the bellows, the dim redness of the fire, the flickering shadows cast on the wall. The horses wait, nodding their heads. The leather harnesses creak softly. The horseshoes make a dull sound as they strike the stone floor. Pigeons, stone floor. It walks slowly on it, occasionally flaps its wings. Then it blends back into the silence. An old man sits on the bench, warms his hands, closes his eyes. There is a tired but peaceful expression on his face. Medieval markets were filled with habits rather than noise. The same routine every morning, the same movements, the same paths. People knew each other. Greetings were short, heads bowed slightly, eyes met gently. The rhythm of the day would rise slowly with the sun. Time seemed to stand still in the middle of the square. Only the light changed. Shadows slowly lengthened, and the marketplace, while the city awoke, continued to maintain its silence. The lands beyond the city. As you step outside the city gates, stone roads gradually turn into dirt paths. Footprints are barely visible on the dew-covered grass. Fog drifts slowly through the fields. Wooden fences are slightly cracked by the cold. A thin layer of frost covers them. Cows raise their heads and exhale. Clouds of vapor briefly hang in the air. The deep sound of bells spreads far away with the wind. A farmer wraps his woolen cloak tightly around his shoulders. His hands are red, lean against the plow handle. He measures and marks the ground. From the nearby barn, the smell of hay wafts out. Wooden doors slowly open. She huddles together. A woman carries water from the well in buckets, takes small steps. Be careful not to slip on the stones by the stream. There is a thin layer of ice. Water flows silently beneath it. Piles of wood beside him. A man raises an axe, lowers it, then stops. Takes a breath. Every movement is economical. Energy is used carefully. The wind passes over the fields, makes the dry grass ripple. The sky is like a light gray blanket. The light is not harsh, it is soft. A horse-drawn carriage moves slowly up the slope. The wheels sink into the mud. Passengers nod silently at each other. The quiet flow of the day. When the sun rises a little higher, the fog slowly disperses. The boundaries of the fields are marked by stone walls. A thin layer of snow is sprinkled on them. In the distance, the blades of a windmill turn regularly. Calmly, the wind doesn't force them, it only directs them. A group of people load bales of hay onto a cart, ropes are tightened, knots are carefully tied. A child blows on his cold, reddened hands, then puts them in his pocket. A dog walks behind its owner, matching its pace. A woman opens the chicken coop door. The chickens slowly come out. Smoke from afar rises from the chimneys, mingles with the sky. A man pulls up the collar of his jacket, adjusts his hat. Conversations are short, voices are low. No one shouts. The wind is already strong enough. It is noisy. The bare branches of the trees reach out to the sky. By the lake, the frozen surface reflects the sun. A farmer shares his bread. The other nods in thanks, and rural life flows on in a quiet order where everyone is connected to each other. Silent libraries and the rupture of time in a stone-walled monastery, the night slowly brightens with candlelight. Long corridors multiply the echoing footsteps on the cold stone floor. In a cell, moonlight seeping through a narrow window falls onto a wooden table. On the table, there is an open parchment. Its edges are worn. It is full of dark stains. A monk dips a quill pen in ink without pressing too hard, draws the letters one by one. The lines progress, then stop. Small notes scribbled on the edge of a calendar, erased dates, numbers scratched off. On a shelf, similar volumes are lined up. Some are newer, some have cracked spines, some books survived a fire. Their edges are blackened. Some have been hastily. It is hidden. The pages are stuck together. Another monk enters the room, quietly lifts the lid of the chest, takes out scrolls, carefully places them on the table, opens one. He bows his head. The text is cut short. An event is described, but there is no end. A name is written, but it is unknown who it is. In the date section, only a blurry trace remains. In these rooms, time does not flow regularly. Some years are recorded at length, some are passed over in a single line, and some are never seen. And centuries later, when people look at these pages, they notice the gaps in between. Those gaps give rise to the feeling of lost centuries. Incomplete chronicles and silent disasters as dawn approaches. The candle wicks are shortened. Ice patterns form on the windows. A monk opens an old chest. The lock is difficult to turn. The scrolls that fall out rise into the air with clouds of dust. Some are sealed, some are untied. The writings are faded. The inks have turned brown. On one parchment, the words "Great Famine" appear, but there are no details. On another, a plague is mentioned, but it doesn't say how many people died. On some, only this sentence remains: "This year was very quiet." Silence, sometimes. It's another way of telling the story of disaster. In the outside world, Armies may have passed, towns may have burned, fields may have been left empty, but most of it hasn't reached these shelves because there may be no one left to write, or there may be no paper, or there may be no time. Monks try to preserve the fragments they have. Each line wants to pass on to the next generation, but the gaps between them show that they don't know either. That's why historians, when looking at this period, see not a complete story, but fragments. And those fragments are slowly put together, but never completely filled in. Cooling climate and agricultural disruption. In some periods of the Middle Ages, behind the years quietly recorded in chronicles, lie slow but effective environmental changes. In many parts of Europe, weather patterns began to deviate from their usual cycle. Summers became cooler, spring was delayed, and autumn arrived early. These seemingly small shifts had major consequences for agricultural societies. The late warming of the soil delayed the germination of seeds, successive rains rotted the grains, and in some years, drought scorched the roots. Barley, rye, and wheat grew shorter, their ears did not fill, and the once bountiful sight in the granaries gave way to half-full shelves. For the peasants, this was not just a temporary disruption, but a sign that determined the fate of the entire year, because when a harvest season is lost, there is no other resource to compensate for it. The peasants tried to predict the next season by observing the sky, the direction of the wind, and the weight of the clouds. They looked to the color of the water accumulating in the soil, the morning dew. They decide whether it's freezing or not by looking at the arrival time of the birds. The grass set aside for the herds of animals becomes insufficient. Some families are forced to slaughter their cattle early to survive the winter, while others try to move their herds to more distant pastures. The consumption of seed grain indicates that the following year is also at risk, because this last portion that should be set aside for the crop ends up on the table under the pressure of hunger. Even if the land is plowed, there is no seed to sow, the fields are left empty, the production chain is silently broken, and this break turns into a permanent decline within a few seasons. This process not only creates hunger, but also leads to a decrease in records, because tax registers, rent lists, and monastery chronicles depend on production. If there is no product, no accounts are kept, debts are postponed, numbers become blurred, and some village names disappear completely from the registers. The harvest quantities and population figures that were once written in detail are replaced by short, vague notes. Thus, the slow change in climate begins to diminish not only the fields, but also history itself. What remains for the following centuries are not notebooks with full pages, but notebooks with long gaps between them. Famine, migration, and the silence of writing. As the agricultural decline lengthens, famine transforms from a common disaster into a permanent state. The crowds once seen in the town squares thin out, prices rise, scales shrink, and vendors speak less. Hunger weakens not only bodies, but also the administrative order. Local administrators cannot collect taxes, registrars leave their ledgers unfinished, and some monasteries lack the trained individuals to keep chronicles. Lines that should describe an era are reduced to mere short notes. This year was hard, the crops didn't grow, many people set out on the road. Migration becomes one of the most prominent traces of these silent years. Families load onto their wagons with a few belongings and animals, slowly making their way to regions said to be more fertile. They leave behind empty houses, collapsed roofs, and uncultivated fields. Some settlements are completely abandoned, becoming silent ruins revealed centuries later by archaeologists. This mobility, combined with the decline in population, makes the production of written sources even more difficult. Because paper was expensive, ink was scarce, and the struggle for survival seemed more urgent than record keeping. When historians look back at this period today, they realize that the gaps in the archives were no accident. The cooling climate, falling harvests, famine, and waves of migration all combined to shroud certain segments of the Middle Ages in a misty veil. This uncertainty, referred to as the lost centuries, does not stem from an absence of major events, but rather from the accumulation of too many ruptures. Life itself became so difficult that people lacked the strength and time to write about their experiences. Disease, weak bodies, and silent towns. As harvests declined and winters lengthened, medieval communities entered a period of growing physical vulnerability. Poor nutrition weakened immune systems, leaving entire populations more susceptible to illness. Chroniclers occasionally noted waves of sickness, though their descriptions were often brief and restrained. Fevers that lingered for weeks, coughs that spread through households, and sudden deaths that unsettled villagers already strained by scarcity. Long before the famous plague pandemics, Europe experienced recurring outbreaks of localized disease that moved quietly along trade routes, river crossings, and seasonal fairs. Market towns that once bustled with movement began to slow. Inns closed early. Caravans reduced their journeys. Priests performed more funerals than weddings, while church bells rang with increasing frequency. Yet even in these moments, records remained fragmentary. Many scribes lacked the resources or stability to maintain detailed chronicles, and some institutions simply collapsed under the pressure of famine and illness. When writing did continue, it often reduced catastrophe to a few restrained phrases. Many fell sick this year. The burial grounds expanded. Travelers avoided the roads. Families responded cautiously. Homes were sealed against cold air. Fires burned day and night when fuel allowed. People avoided crowded spaces, not through scientific understanding, but through lived experience passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor. In rural districts, farms were abandoned when too many hands were lost to sickness. Fields lay unsown, which deepened the next year's shortages and extended the cycle of hardship. In this way, disease did not appear as a sudden rupture, but as a slow companion to hunger, reinforcing instability over decades rather than months. Demographic collapse and vanishing records. Over time, the combined pressures of climate stress, crop failure, and recurring illness reshaped Europe's demographic landscape. Populations thinned unevenly. Some valleys emptied while neighboring regions survived with reduced numbers. Entire hamlets disappeared from tax registers, pilgrimage lists, and monastery inventories. Roads that once linked communities faded into grass and mud. Bridges fell into disrepair. Trading networks contracted, isolating settlements that had previously depended on distant grain supplies. This shrinking world left a clear imprint on historical documentation. Fewer people meant fewer clerks, fewer monks trained in literacy, fewer administrators capable of preserving archives. Parchment became precious. Ink was reused. Older manuscripts were scraped clean and overwritten, erasing earlier generations of notes in order to record immediate concerns such as debts, boundaries, and emergency grain distributions. The past quite literally vanished beneath the needs of the present. Modern historians encounter these centuries as landscapes of silence punctuated by sudden flashes of detail. A single surviving charter may describe a flood, a dispute over land, or a gift to a monastery, followed by decades without another reference to the same village. Archaeology often fills part of the gap, revealing abandoned hearths, collapsed roofs, and shrinking graveyards. Together, these traces suggest not an absence of history, but a period in which survival absorbed most of society's energy, leaving little room for systematic record-keeping. Thus, the so-called lost centuries emerged not from mystery alone, but from accumulation. Weakened bodies, shrinking communities, disrupted institutions, and the quiet erosion of writing itself. What survives is a scattered mosaic fragments of lives lived under pressure, preserved not in continuous narratives, but in the long spaces between surviving lines of ink. Eroding authority in a contracting world. As medieval communities endured colder seasons, shrinking harvests, and recurring waves of illness, political authority began to erode across large portions of Europe. Lords who depended on agricultural surplus to support their households, and soldiers found their revenues steadily declining. Without grain to collect or rent to enforce, they struggled to repair walls, maintain roads, or supply garrisons stationed at border strongholds. Small castles that had once symbolized stability slowly slipped into neglect, their roofs leaking, their wooden galleries rotting, their watchtowers staffed by fewer guards than before. Local officials faced similar pressures. Courts met less frequently. Legal disputes went unresolved for months or years. Tax collectors returned with half-empty ledgers and quiet explanations about deserted farms or families that had fled in search of better land. Authority that had once rested on visible routine now appeared fragile and uncertain. In some valleys, rival nobles contested shrinking resources, while in others, village communities relied increasingly on informal agreements rather than distant overlords whose reach had weakened. Travel became riskier. Patrols diminished along roads and river crossings, allowing banditry to grow in the spaces left by retreating institutions. Merchants altered their routes. Pilgrims traveled in larger groups. Inns fortified their doors earlier each evening. Chroniclers occasionally recorded skirmishes, burned storehouses, or disputed boundaries, yet these entries often lacked detail, compressed into short remarks that hinted at disruption without explaining its full scale. The combination of reduced manpower and shrinking income quietly reshaped political landscapes, transforming once organized territories into patchworks of local power whose outlines blurred from decade to decade. Fragmented rule and the deepening silence. Over time, weakened authority produced cascading effects. When protection failed, farmers hesitated to plant distant fields. When toll bridges collapsed, trade slowed further. When arbitration disappeared, feuds lingered across generations, draining communities already exhausted by scarcity. Some fortified towns withdrew behind their walls, and limited access to outsiders. Rural hamlets clustered closer together for safety, abandoning isolated homesteads and forest clearings that had once expanded settlement frontiers. These adjustments left their mark on written records. Charters were issued less often. Administrative correspondence thinned. Boundary surveys halted mid-sentence. Monasteries that had once acted as regional archives shifted their attention toward preserving what little they possessed rather than producing new chronicles. Pages that might have documented negotiations or campaigns remained blank, not because nothing occurred, but because survival demanded immediate attention and literacy became a luxury few could maintain. Historians examining these decades encounter a pattern of shrinking documentation aligned with growing instability. Coins are debased. Fortifications show signs of hasty repair. Layers of ash appear in excavations where no written account survives to explain their origin. Political fragmentation, combined with environmental stress and demographic decline, deepens the archival shadows already forming across the period. The lost centuries thus grow darker, not through sudden catastrophe alone, but through a gradual withdrawal of institutions that once generated steady streams of written memory. When authority dissolves slowly rather than collapsing all at once, its traces fade quietly. Paper is not produced. Agreements are not copied. Events pass unrecorded. What remains for later generations is not a single dramatic silence, but a long sequence of interrupted lines, missing ledgers, and abando. Shrinking routes and silent harbors. As political authority fragmented and rural production faltered, Europe's trading networks began to contract. Roads that had once carried grain, salt, wool, and wine across long distances grew uneven and poorly maintained. Bridges weakened when toll revenues disappeared, while river crossings shifted as banks eroded and ferries ceased to operate regularly. Merchants adjusted their itineraries, avoiding unstable districts and preferring coastal routes when storms allowed safe passage. Yet even these maritime corridors became less reliable as ports lost workers and shipyards struggled to secure timber, rope, and pitch. Market towns felt the change first. Warehouses stood half empty. Scales rested idle on wooden counters. Foreign coins circulated less frequently, replaced by local tokens or barter arrangements that reflected shrinking horizons. Customs officials recorded fewer arrivals, when they recorded anything at all. Ledgers that once listed cargoes in careful columns now ended abruptly, their final pages filled with uncertain estimates rather than precise tallies. Travelers remarked on stretches of countryside where inns had closed and milestones lay toppled into weeds, leaving wagons to creep forward along uncertain paths. These disruptions were not the result of a single disaster, but of cumulative pressures that unfolded over decades. Reduced harvests, limited surplus for export, illness thinned the workforce required to move goods, political disputes made toll stations unpredictable. In combination, these forces shortened the effective distances between communities. Villages that once depended on imported salt or iron reverted to local substitutes. Regions that had traded wine for grain narrowed their exchanges to neighboring valleys. Europe's economic map slowly folded inward, compressing long-distance connections into fragile, intermittent threads. Urban contraction and fading commercial records. Cities, once sustained by the constant flow of goods and people, also adjusted to this shrinking world. Neighborhoods near outer walls emptied first, their houses collapsing or converted into gardens and pasture. Workshops closed when customers vanished, guild halls met less often, and apprentices sought work closer to home rather than in distant centers of craft production. Municipal governments faced declining tax bases which forced reductions in street maintenance, public lighting, and harbor dredging. Canals silted up. Quays cracked. Storehouses echoed with silence. The written traces of urban life thinned alongside economic activity. Account books were shortened. Shipping manifests stopped mid-year. Contracts that once detailed partnerships between merchants gave way to brief acknowledgements of debt or emergency sales of property. In some ports, registers of arriving ships survive for 1 decade and then disappear entirely for the next, leaving historians to infer decline from archaeology rather than paper. Excavations confirm these textual gaps. Layers of refuse grow thinner, imported ceramics vanish from household assemblages, coin hoards shrink in number and variety. Such material evidence mirrors what the archives fail to say directly, that commercial systems had contracted enough to disrupt not only daily routines, but also the bureaucratic habits that generated historical memory. Through this gradual narrowing of exchange, the lost centuries deepen once more. Fewer transactions produce fewer documents. Fewer travelers carry fewer stories between regions. What remains is a landscape of partial connections and interrupted accounts, where Europe continues to function, but at a quieter, slower rhythm that leaves only faint impressions in the historical record. Faith, fear, and the search for meaning. As material conditions worsened across parts of medieval Europe, communities turned increasingly toward religious frameworks to interpret the pressures surrounding them. Crop failures, sickness, and local conflict were rarely viewed as random events. Instead, they were woven into spiritual explanations that drew on sermons, biblical stories, and long-established traditions of divine testing and moral correction. Parish priests urged repentance. Processions moved slowly through fields and village streets, carrying candles, relics, and banners embroidered with saints' names. Bells rang not only for worship, but for collective appeals for mercy, their steady tones drifting across emptying marketplaces and frozen rivers. Households added small rituals to daily life. Prayers were recited before planting or slaughtering livestock. Icons and wooden crosses were fixed above doors. Some families kept scraps of parchment with psalms written on them, folded and worn from handling. Monasteries organized extended fasts and vigils, while monks copied penitential texts that circulated between cloisters, encouraging humility and endurance. In this environment, spiritual practice offered both explanation and comfort, a structure for fear that transformed uncertainty into something that could be spoken aloud, shared, and endured together. These responses also shaped the historical record itself. Chroniclers framed disasters as moral lessons rather than logistical failures, emphasizing repentance more than rainfall totals or grain prices. When notes were brief, they often highlighted prayer rather than production. A year might be summarized not by the number of empty barns, but by the number of days spent fasting. Such choices do not indicate ignorance, but priorities. Writers recorded what they believed mattered most, and in doing so, left later generations with documents rich in spiritual language, but sparse in technical detail. This devotional filter contributes to the sense of opacity that surrounds the period, reinforcing the impression that certain centuries slipped from view. Ritual landscapes and cultural memory. Public ritual extended beyond church walls into the countryside itself. Fields were blessed with holy water. Boundary stones were touched during seasonal walks. Villagers gathered at crossroads to sing litanies, their voices rising into cold air as torches flickered against low clouds. Shrines along roads received offerings of bread, candles, and coins left by travelers seeking protection. Even as trade routes shrank and towns contracted, these symbolic circuits remained active, stitching communities together through shared gestures rather than commercial exchange. Art and storytelling followed similar patterns. Wall paintings in chapels emphasized judgment and salvation. Mystery plays dramatized suffering saints and deliverance after trial. Oral tales circulated about wandering holy figures or miraculous springs, embedding hardship within narratives that promised eventual restoration. Much of this cultural activity leaves little direct archival trace, surviving instead in later retellings or faint archaeological echoes. Wooden statues decay. Cloth banners rot. Songs vanish unless someone eventually commits them to parchment. Here again, the mechanics of loss become visible. Cultural expression flourished precisely when administrative documentation faltered. People invested energy in prayer, performance, and remembrance rather than in maintaining ledgers or correspondence networks. The result is a skewed archive, dense with sermons and devotional fragments, thin on census figures or shipping lists. To historians, this imbalance looks like absence, even though daily life continued with emotional and symbolic intensity. Through these layered religious and cultural responses, medieval societies adapted to prolonged stress while unintentionally reshaping the record they left behind. The lost centuries thus gain another dimension, not merely environmental or political, but interpretive. Hardship was processed through faith, and faith determined what was written. What survives today is therefore not a neutral account of everything that happened, but a carefully filtered reflection of what contemporaries believed was most essential to preserve. Fading schools and narrowing literacy. As economic contraction, illness, and political fragmentation persisted, medieval Europe's fragile educational structures came under increasing pressure. Cathedral schools and small monastic classrooms depended on surplus resources, steady patronage, and stable populations. When revenues fell and communities scattered, these institutions struggled to remain open. Teachers departed in search of better supported posts. Students returned to family farms or workshops where labor mattered more than letters. Over time, fewer children learned to read Latin, the language of administration, theology, and law, narrowing the circle of people capable of producing written records. Scriptoria, the rooms where monks once copied texts in careful rows, grew quieter. Candle wax became expensive. Parchment supplies tightened as livestock herds shrank. Existing manuscripts were reused, scraped clean and overwritten with new prayers or legal notes. This practice, known today through palimpsests, reflects both scarcity and urgency. The immediate needs of the present displaced the intellectual inheritance of the past. Works of history, science, and classical learning sometimes disappeared beneath newer layers of ink, surviving only faintly where modern imaging techniques can recover their ghosts. This educational contraction did not mean curiosity vanished. Knowledge continued to circulate, but through narrower channels. Craft skills passed from master to apprentice by demonstration rather than treatise. Agricultural techniques were shared at field edges rather than in manuals. Medical remedies traveled as spoken recipes rather than written formularies. The shift from written to oral transmission ensured survival, but it also made continuity fragile. What was not memorized or ritually repeated risks slipping away, leaving uneven traces for later generations to reconstruct. Oral worlds and the thinning of archives. As literacy narrowed, oral culture expanded to fill the vacuum. Storytelling, sermons, legal testimony, and communal memory carried practical information as well as moral guidance. Village elders recalled boundary lines. Merchants memorized routes. Midwives preserved treatments learned from predecessors. Yet spoken knowledge leaves little direct archaeological footprint unless eventually written down. And during these strained centuries, much of it never was. Administrative systems suffered accordingly. Fewer charters were drafted. Court proceedings went unrecorded or were summarized months later from memory. Contracts relied on witnesses rather than documents. When disputes arose generations afterward, communities often lacked written proof to support their claims, deepening uncertainty about land ownership and political rights. Monasteries that once functioned as regional record centers turned inward, prioritizing spiritual copying over historical chronicle. Modern historians confront this thinning archive as one of the central reasons certain medieval periods appear dimly lit compared with others. The lost centuries are not empty of activity, but empty of paper. Excavated farm tools, altered field systems, and reused building materials testify to ongoing adaptation even when texts fall silent. Knowledge did not vanish, it changed shape. It flowed through voices, habits, and repeated gestures rather than ink and parchment. This transformation in how information moved through society created long shadows for later scholarship. Generations passed before literacy networks expanded again, leaving gaps that cannot be fully bridged. The silence of the archives thus reflects not a collapse of human thought, but a shift in priorities under pressure, where survival outranked documentation and memory relied more on living communities than on written pages. Reading landscapes when pages fall silent, when written records thin or disappear, historians must turn outward to the physical world itself. Fields, forests, rivers, and ruined walls become alternative archives, preserving traces of human activity long after ink has faded. Across Europe, archaeologists excavate abandoned farmsteads, sunken roads, and collapsed storage pits, whose contents speak indirectly of demographic change and shifting agricultural practices. Layers of pollen trapped in lake sediments reveal which crops were planted and which forests regrew after fields were deserted. Tree rings record sequences of drought and cold, showing years when growth slowed dramatically. Together, these environmental markers provide a slow, patient chronicle that runs parallel to human memory. Excavations of medieval villages often uncover patterns that match the archival gaps. Hearths shrink in number. Animal bones become more uniform, suggesting reduced diets. Imported pottery disappears, replaced by coarse local wares. Coin finds thin out, indicating contracting trade networks. Even the orientation of new buildings changes, reflecting adjustments to wind exposure or flooding risk. These physical details do not offer names or dates in the way documents do, but they accumulate into persuasive narratives when viewed across regions and generations. Climate science adds another layer of insight. Ice cores drilled from glaciers preserve chemical signatures of volcanic eruptions that darkened skies and cooled summers for years at a time. Such events can be aligned with archaeological downturns and brief chronicle entries mentioning strange weather or failed harvests. In this way, natural archives compensate for missing texts, providing continuity where administrative writing faltered. Piecing together the quiet centuries, historical reconstruction in these contexts resembles assembling a mosaic from scattered fragments rather than reading a continuous scroll. A charred beam from a farmhouse, a sudden drop in charcoal production, or a surge in burial sites can hint at conflict, famine, or disease, even when no contemporary narrative survives. Survey teams mapped deserted medieval villages whose outlines remain visible only as gentle rises in pasture or subtle discolorations in aerial photography. These ghost settlements reveal waves of abandonment that once rippled across landscapes now peaceful and cultivated. Scholars compared data across disciplines, aligning archaeological layers with botanical samples, isotopic analysis of human bones, and remnants of river dredging or harbor repair. Each dataset is incomplete on its own, but together they reconstruct rhythms of contraction and recovery that written records fail to capture. This interdisciplinary approach has transformed how the so-called lost centuries are understood, replacing notions of total collapse with more nuanced pictures of adaptation, retreat, and slow rebuilding. Yet even with these tools, uncertainty remains. Dating margins can span decades. Regional experiences differ sharply. Some valleys flourish while others empty. The patchwork nature of survival ensures that no single explanation fits the entire continent. What emerges instead is a continent adjusting unevenly to pressure, leaving behind quiet material signals rather than dramatic inscriptions. Through soil samples, tree rings, glacier cores, and abandoned stone foundations, modern investigators illuminate stretches of medieval time that once seemed inaccessible. The lost centuries are not recovered as complete stories, but as carefully inferred sequences stitched together from earth and wood rather than from parchment and ink. Islands of recovery in a shaken continent, while many regions struggled for generations under cold summers and unstable harvests, others slowly began to regain balance. River valleys with fertile alluvial soils proved more resilient, absorbing climatic shocks better than upland plateaus. Communities clustered near waterways adapted by shifting crop choices, favoring hardier grains such as rye and oats over more temperature-sensitive wheat. Drainage ditches were reopened, marshlands were cautiously reclaimed, and terraces on hillsides were repaired stone by stone, preventing erosion and conserving precious warmth in thin soils. Monastic estates became central to this fragile stabilization. Their scriptoria preserved practical knowledge about planting schedules, livestock breeding, and seasonal rotation. Monks recorded experiments with different sowing dates, noting which fields resisted frost and which slopes ripened earliest under pale northern suns. Surplus, when it appeared, was stored in reinforced granaries rather than immediately consumed, creating modest buffers against the next poor year. These religious houses also served as local redistribution hubs, lending seed grain to neighboring villages and collecting rents in kind instead of coin, thereby sustaining rural networks when markets remained weak. Small market towns revived unevenly. Fairs reappeared along crossroads and river fords, though on reduced scales, with wool, salted fish, iron tools, and rough cloth replacing luxury imports. Craftspeople returned cautiously, repairing plowshares and millstones rather than producing decorative goods. The tempo of life remained slow and defensive, shaped less by ambition than by vigilance. Yet these modest adaptations laid the groundwork for wider recovery in centuries to come. Uneven paths toward stability. Recovery never unfolded uniformly across medieval Europe. Coastal regions tied to maritime trade often rebounded earlier, sustained by fisheries and intermittent shipping lanes that reopened whenever weather allowed. Inland mountain districts, by contrast, continued to empty as families migrated downslope towards milder climates and better watered soils. Archaeological surveys show clusters of new hamlets forming near former Roman roads or monastery lands, while older highland settlements quietly dissolved into pasture and forest. Agricultural innovation accelerated cautiously rather than dramatically. Heavier plows adapted to wet soils, improved horse harnesses, and the gradual spread of three-field rotation increased resilience more than outright productivity. These changes reduced catastrophic losses during bad years rather than guaranteeing abundance during good ones. Population growth resumed in fragile pulses, interrupted repeatedly by renewed cold spells, floods, or disease. Parish cemeteries expanded, shrank, and expanded again, their rhythms mirroring environmental uncertainty. What defines this phase of the lost centuries is not sudden renaissance but patient recalibration. Societies learned to hedge risk, diversify production, and accept lower surpluses in exchange for survival. Written records cautiously returned as rents stabilized and legal disputes re-emerged, yet entire decades remain thinly documented, particularly in peripheral zones far from royal courts or episcopal centers. The silence in the sources gradually lifted, not with a dramatic proclamation, but with the soft reappearance of lists, charters, and marginal notes that suggest communities once again felt confident enough to write their world down. Local power in an age of fragile recovery. As agricultural output slowly stabilized in selected regions, political authority followed the contours of the land. Where harvests improved, local lords expanded their influence, fortifying wooden keeps, repairing stone towers, and organizing armed retinues not for conquest but for protection. In a landscape still scarred by abandonment and uncertainty, security became a form of currency. Villagers accepted obligations in labor and grain in exchange for guarded storehouses, defended roads, and arbitration in disputes over shrinking pastures and water rights. Royal administrations, weakened during decades of demographic decline, struggled to project authority across fractured territories. Travel was dangerous, revenues inconsistent, and officials scarce. As a result, justice and taxation increasingly fell into the hands of castellans, abbots, and regional magnates who governed within sight of their fields rather than from distant capitals. These micro-centers of power produced their own charters and account rolls, modest in scale yet vital for reconstructing everyday medieval governance after the lost centuries. Wax seals multiplied. Boundary stones were reset. Toll rights were renegotiated along rivers that had shifted their courses during flood-prone decades. Social hierarchies subtly shifted. Some peasant families rose by accumulating abandoned plots, while minor nobles slipped into obscurity after failing to maintain armed followers. Authority grew more pragmatic than ideological, rooted in harvest forecasts, weather law, and the management of mills and ovens. Politics, in this phase, was not conducted in grand assemblies but in barns, cloisters, and courtyard hearings held beneath grey skies. Contracts, communities, and the return of written order. With stability came paperwork. Agreements once sealed only by memory or oath were increasingly committed to parchment, especially where land disputes or tax exemptions could determine survival. Monasteries trained scribes to copy contracts between tenants and lords, listing rents in sheaves of rye, days of ploughing service, or shares of wine from marginal vineyards that clung to south-facing slopes. These documents reveal a society recalibrating its expectations, formalizing relationships that had grown fluid during decades of crisis. Village assemblies gained renewed importance. Elders met at church porches or crossroads to negotiate collective obligations, decide when communal fields would be sown, and allocate scarce pasture after harsh winters. Watch duties were organized, bridges maintained, and storage pits inspected before snow-closed mountain passes. Such communal governance softened aristocratic power, embedding it within routines of cooperation rather than constant coercion. Yet the political map remained unstable. In borderlands, rival lords contested toll stations and ferry crossings, while royal envoys attempted to reassert fiscal claims long dormant. Charters overlapped, privileges conflicted, and litigation multiplied in episcopal courts, producing thick bundles of records that historians now mine for glimpses of reconstruction. The lost centuries did not end with a single decree or coronation. They faded unevenly, replaced by a patchwork of jurisdictions whose very complexity marks a world once again confident enough to argue, record, and plan for the future. Urban revival and the return of trade. By the late phases of the lost centuries, urban centers in fertile regions began to regain life. Small towns, often located along navigable rivers or near crossroads, attracted migrants from surrounding villages where land scarcity, lingering cold spells, or weak harvests persisted. Timber-framed houses were repaired or rebuilt. Streets once choked with mud and debris were cleared and compacted. Market squares reopened as merchants bought textiles, salted fish, pottery, and iron tools to sell in carefully organized stalls. Though the scale of commerce remained modest compared to the earlier high medieval period, these renewed exchanges signaled the tentative expansion of local economies. Guilds re-emerged, regulating craftsmanship and apprenticeship, ensuring that skill and knowledge persisted despite decades of disruption. Blacksmiths repaired plows, shoemakers produced durable boots, and weavers replaced worn cloth with new wool. Coin circulation increased gradually as barter slowly gave way to monetary transactions, particularly in towns with access to rivers or minor ports. Merchants established temporary fairs to coincide with religious festivals, spreading news, goods, and techniques between settlements. These events fostered social cohesion, allowed families to network, and reinforced a sense of continuity even when written records were still sparse in surrounding rural areas. Yet growth was uneven. Coastal towns engaged in maritime trade recovered more quickly than interior towns constrained by poor roads and abandoned bridges. Political stability was local rather than centralized, and communities learned to navigate multiple authorities, lords, abbots, and royal agents, each asserting overlapping claims on goods and labor. Despite these challenges, urban revival reflected not only economic opportunity but also human resilience, demonstrating that social structures could reassert themselves gradually even after prolonged decline and environmental stress. Patchwork prosperity across the continent. Rural-urban interactions intensified as villagers traveled to town markets to sell surplus produce and acquire tools or imported goods. Inns reopened to host travelers and merchants, while bridges and ferries, previously neglected, were repaired through collective effort or toll income. Coastal fishers maintained networks along rivers, supplying both city and countryside with salted fish, and preserving trade connections despite intermittent winter ice or stormy seas. This patchwork economic network reinforced social resilience, providing channels for information and sustenance even as distant monarchs or bishops exerted minimal influence. Written documentation gradually became more prevalent in these centers. Tax rolls, merchant contracts, and guild charters provide historians with increasingly detailed snapshots of production, commerce, and household obligations. While still thin compared with peak medieval records, the growing accumulation of local texts demonstrates renewed confidence in governance, accounting, and property rights. Literacy expanded alongside economic activity, concentrated primarily in towns and monasteries, creating focal points for record keeping and learning that helped stabilize communities. Nevertheless, recovery remained fragile. Environmental volatility could still disrupt harvests, local conflicts occasionally interrupted markets, and disease periodically claimed populations. The uneven revival of cities and villages highlights the complex dynamics of the lost centuries, a continent never entirely frozen in stasis, yet far from the prosperity and connectivity of earlier eras. Across Europe, however, the combination of cautious urban growth, reactivated trade, and incremental rebuilding laid the foundation for the more sustained economic expansion that would emerge in the following centuries. Cultural and economic ripples in rebuilding towns. As towns slowly regained population, social life began to reassert itself across Europe's recovering regions. Markets buzzed once more with the measured rhythm of barter and coin exchange. Blacksmiths, coopers, weavers, and potters returned to their workshops, producing both practical and decorative goods. Merchants traveled between towns carrying essential commodities such as salt, iron tools, and cloth, while also bringing news, stories, and trends from distant communities. Inns, strategically placed at crossroads or river fords, provided shelter for travelers and facilitated information exchange, knitting together a continent that had been isolated for decades. Religious institutions played dual roles in this renewal. Churches and monasteries hosted markets on feast days, blending spiritual observance with economic necessity. Festivals and processions marked the seasons, combining devotion, social gathering, and commerce. Artisans benefited indirectly, as embroidered banners, painted icons, and wooden carvings were commissioned for both sacred and civic purposes. Education slowly spread in these urban hubs, with apprentices and literacy programs providing the foundation for future intellectual recovery. The combined effect of commerce, religion, and education created small but vital circuits of resilience, reinforcing the continuity of community life despite past instability. Resilient networks and everyday adaptation, villages continue to interact with towns, bringing grain, wool, and livestock to markets, while retrieving tools, textiles, and knowledge. Social hierarchies persisted, but they adapted pragmatically. Local lords and merchants often negotiated directly with village assemblies or guild councils, mediating disputes over land, trade, and labor. Roads and river crossings, once abandoned, were repaired incrementally, enabling smoother movement of goods and people. Even modest improvements in infrastructure amplified connectivity and strengthened regional cohesion. Cultural life flourished quietly alongside these economic gains. Storytelling, oral histories, and minor festivals sustained shared memory and identity, supplementing written records that remained concentrated in monasteries and urban centers. Practical knowledge about crops, livestock, and seasonal cycles was transmitted orally or through apprenticeship, ensuring continuity even in regions with minimal formal documentation. Over time, these overlapping networks of commerce, faith, and tradition produced a more stable, though still cautious society. The lost centuries were gradually revealed not as an absolute void, but as a patchwork of adaptation, survival, and incremental rebuilding, laying the groundwork for the relative prosperity and connectedness that would characterize Europe in later centuries. Reflections on the Lost Centuries. As our journey through Europe's lost centuries comes to a close, the contours of medieval life emerge with both fragility and resilience. From the silent fields abandoned after failed harvests to the sparse charters kept in monasteries, the story is not one of total disappearance, but of adaptation under stress. Villages, towns, rivers, and forests each played a role in preserving memory and sustaining survival. Harsh winters, unpredictable harvests, and social upheaval challenged communities, yet people endured by weaving practical knowledge, ritual, and faith into daily life. Monks recorded what mattered, villagers passed lessons orally, artisans maintained skills across generations. Even when written records grew thin, life continued with persistent rhythms of labor, prayer, and social interaction. The lost centuries are better understood not as empty voids, but as periods of transformation. Economic contraction, educational narrowing, environmental pressures, and social restructuring all combined to shape Europe's trajectory. The silence in documents reflects more than absence. It mirrors the pragmatic choices of people prioritizing survival, community cohesion, and spiritual continuity. These centuries were lived with care, endurance, and subtle ingenuity, leaving behind traces that archaeologists, historians, and scientists now painstakingly assemble into coherent narratives. Each fragment, whether a soil layer, a tree ring, or a marginal note in a chronicle, contributes to the mosaic of a Europe that endured through uncertainty. A gentle farewell and invitation. Through these centuries, the human experience, Its fears, hopes, and quiet perseverance shines more vividly than raw statistics or grand battles. We see families managing dwindling resources, children learning skills from elders, and communities negotiating survival under environmental and social strain. The lessons embedded in these stories remind us that even in periods labeled lost, life adapts, connections endure, and meaning persists. The seemingly silent centuries resonate with soft human echoes, patience, resilience, and ingenuity guiding daily existence. As we conclude this exploration, we invite you to rest, reflect, and carry these quiet histories into your own imagination. If these narratives have guided you into a calmer state, consider supporting our work by subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Your engagement ensures that stories from the forgotten corners of history reach more listeners, helping preserve memory while soothing the mind. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the centuries whisper their lessons of endurance, community, and the subtle unfolding of human life across the quiet, snowy landscapes of Europe. Thank you for listening, and may your rest be deep and peaceful.